Remnant 2 was one of my most anticipated games for this year given how great the first one was. Remnant 1 felt like such a confidently made game with a somewhat small scope but excellent execution on what it set out to do back in 2019. The defining features of that game were its fantastic gun-based combat, its accessible approach to difficulty, and its procedurally generated levels, offering hours of replay value. 4 years later, and we now have a sequel promising new weapons, new worlds to explore, and of course, new bosses to defeat. Is Remnant 2 a worthy sequel to the now infamous cult classic Remnant from the Ashes? Let's see. During the lead up to Remnant 2's release, I've seen a lot of discussion regarding if you need to play the first game before getting into this one. If you ask me, I think you absolutely should play the first one before this one because it's a great game, but you definitely don't need to if you just want to go straight for the second. I'm going to get into it more later, but the story in Remnant 1 and 2 isn't super core to the experience, so if you're a newcomer wondering if you will be confused or punished for missing out on the first one, I wouldn't worry about it. You'll be fine starting here. I'm actually going to start with visuals and performance first because it's by far the most noticeable difference from the first game. Remnant 2 is a massive step up in visual quality from its predecessor. That's saying a lot, given the first one was definitely no slouch in this department, but you could definitely tell that that game was working with a much lower budget compared to some other AAA stuff out at the time. Environments were generally pretty flat and basic looking, and a lot of animations left a lot to be desired. With Remnant 2 though, it's very obvious the team had a much larger budget to work with, and they used every bit of it to make this game look amazing. Environments are so much more detailed than anything in the first game, and the use of lighting here is awesome. I mean, Remnant 2 is right up there with the other great looking AAA games from this year, and I just think it's a massive upgrade over the original. Unfortunately though, this visual glow up isn't all good news. Remnant 2 is a stunning looking game, but man does it perform like one too. This game is much more demanding than the first game, and as such, a lot of people simply aren't going to be able to run it well. I'll tell you about how it ran for me to give you an idea of this. I'm also going to have my specs on screen so you can see what I'm working with here. Now I started with everything on max at 1440p, no DLSS. 1440p is generally what I aim for on this PC, given it looks decently better than 1080, but isn't near as demanding as 4K. That didn't go well at all. I was way below the 60 FPS that I was looking for, so into the settings I went. I turned on DLSS, and that helped quite a bit, but I still wasn't at what I would call a smooth frame rate. I then dropped the settings down to medium, and that didn't really do much at all for whatever reason, so I ultimately ended up with all settings on high, resolution at 1080p, and DLSS on quality mode, and that got me about 80 FPS in most situations. That's a pretty massive downgrade compared to the first game, where I was able to run it at max settings, 1440p, locked to 144 FPS. Personally, I'm okay with the trade-off, because like I said, this game looks incredible next to the first one, but I'm guessing quite a lot of people simply aren't going to be able to run this game well, given how much more demanding it is. Alright, let's do story next. So as you would expect, Remnant 2 is a direct sequel to From the Ashes, although not super direct. It takes place some 20 or so years after the events of the first game. Your main character is not the one that you had in From the Ashes, rather someone completely new. All the familiar characters are back, as well as a pretty large amount of new characters to interact with. They all make subtle references here and there about the events in the first game, but nothing that's going to confuse newcomers, which is good. Now the main goal of Remnant 2 is clear from the very start. The root, which was the main threat in the first game, is still a major problem for Earth and its people, so you need to do whatever you can to help fight back. This of course means returning to the infamous Worldstone Crystal in order to travel to and from other worlds to find and stop the source of the root. Unfortunately though, disaster strikes and one of your main allies is taken by the crystal, and your new objective is clear. Follow her in and find her by any means necessary. What follows is actually a pretty cool narrative overall, filled with interesting characters and quests. Remnant 2 again relies pretty heavily on environmental storytelling and hidden diaries to flesh out the world and help you figure out exactly what is going on. I think Remnant 2 does a much better job at giving you an interesting story to follow than the first game did, because it actually wants you to care about it this time around. The story in Remnant 1 felt very last minute and was really only there to provide a reason and context for what you were doing, but here I found myself much more invested in the narrative. It never overstays its boundaries though either. The story here, like the first game, is still very optional and doesn't go on any longer than it needs to. One complaint I do have here is that one of the other main characters from the first game is also lost to the World Stone at the start, but what's weird though is that you literally never see this character again. They're there with you quite a bit at the start of the game, and then they kinda just disappear. I'm assuming they are saving them for a DLC or something, but at least as it is right now, this just felt off. Alright, let's get into gameplay and combat now. There's not too much to go over here because it's very similar to the first game, but there's some good changes here and there. So the general flow of combat is basically unchanged. You've still got your handgun, your long gun, and your melee weapon, as well as one modification for each gun. Gunplay is where the first game really excelled, and I'm pleased to say that it's even better here. Weapons have even better audio feedback when they're shot, and every weapon feels unique. Weapon balancing also feels much better here than in the first game. There were absolutely some weapons in that game that could just negate any challenge on the lower difficulties, but I didn't run into any of those here. Weapons are also much more detailed in their design here compared to the more flat and basic looking ones of the first game. Same goes for weapon mods. There's of course a lot of returning ones, but there's plenty of new ones to experiment with too. You've also still got the ability to upgrade weapons, although I noticed that this is way more grindy than in the first game. In the first game, you would get a ton of currencies super fast and were able to fully max out all of your gear very early on because of it. In Remnant 2, it takes a much longer time to collect enough resources and currency to afford even just a few upgrades. This was likely done to encourage people to try new weapons instead of just maxing out one weapon early on and sticking with it for the entire game, so I'm fine with this change. Oh, and one other quality of life change they made was that you now no longer use stamina outside of combat, so you can sprint forever as long as you aren't actively engaging an enemy. This just helps cut down on downtime, so that's a really good quality of life change. Okay, let's talk bosses now. Bosses were another standout from the first game because of their cool designs and well-telegraphed attacks. Remnant 2 also excels in this category. The bosses here all look great as you would expect, and some of them are especially memorable. But who cares if a boss looks cool and isn't fun to fight, right? Fortunately, Remnant 2's bosses are all extremely well designed. Each one will test you in a different way than the last, in a way that always feels fair, yet still challenging. There wasn't a single death I had in this game where I felt like it wasn't my fault. Remnant 2 also has a gimmick boss that I won't show for spoiler reasons, but funnily enough, this is the one that took me the most attempts, with the last boss being a close second. So yeah, Remnant 2 absolutely keeps up with the tradition of fantastic boss design the original was known for. Procedural Generation is the last major thing I want to get into. Keeping up with the tradition, and unsurprisingly, it's great, and a huge improvement over the first game. Now, Procedural Generation was one of the defining aspects on Remnant 1 because of how well it worked, and because of how much replay value it added to that game. It wasn't just the layout of areas that was randomized, but pretty much everything else from items, boss locations, and even the order of which you would go to the next area. This ensured that pretty much every time you went back for another campaign, it was guaranteed to be a fairly different experience than the last time. All of that remains true in the sequel, except it's dialed up even further here. In Remnant 1, you could absolutely see the tile sets used to create the areas that you moved through if you looked close enough. Now, I'm sure the same will happen in 2, but it's much less obvious thanks to the drastically increased fidelity of the environments. The generation is also just way more confident and advanced here given that it can now work with verticality. This is a really big upgrade given that the areas generated in the first game were always really flat. There's also just more things that can be generated this time around, like temples with rewards in them, traps, or other cool things. All of this ensures that Remnant 2 is even more of a replayable game, and it remains one of the defining features of this series. I'll quickly mention some final things that I felt didn't need their own dedicated section in this video. The difficulty here is basically the exact same as the first game, with very easy to understand combat and controls, but with enemies and bosses that will constantly challenge you. I didn't find myself dying any more or any less than in the first game. The class system is way better here than in the first game, given that they are much more like, well, classes here. The first game had classes too, but they were all very similar and didn't offer a super different gameplay style from one another. Here though, each class is very different and has its own attributes that you need to learn in order to be effective. I went with the Handler class because it comes with a dog that can revive you if you die. This is probably the one that I would recommend anyone playing solo to start with. And that's Remnant 2. I came away with this game very impressed by just how much better it is than the original in basically every way. A lot of times, sequels will improve on the main weaknesses of their predecessor, but also change a lot of other things that people may not like. Here though, the developers knew exactly what made the first game so great, and just improved upon it. I really liked my time with Remnant 2, and if you decide to give it a shot, I think you will too.